Good afternoon. Today, the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston brings you a conversation with one of our most popular and interesting speakers from the New York Times Beirut Bureau Chief, Ben Hubbard, on the rise of power of Mohammed bin Salman. My name is Felicia Chapman, the Senior International Education Manager of the World Affairs Council, a bipartisan nonprofit organization focused on better understanding of world issues and how they affect personal lives. Before we begin, I'd love to say hello to all of our members and students from the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. If you're not a member and you're interested in learning more about world issues, please make sure you find more information on our website at wachouston.org. If you're a current member, thank you. I know you're proud to be a part of Houston's premier organization for bipartisan understanding. We have some exciting new updates for our members that we will be sharing. Our upcoming speakers include, on July 1st, Canadian Consul General Rachel McCormick, speaking about Canada and the U.S., essential allies for trade, energy, and a changing world. On July 8th, we have Dr. Peniel Joseph, the founding director of the University of Texas Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. On July 15th, we have a special exclusive member event for the Dr. Richard Haas, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, talking about the world and introduction. The World Affairs Council of Greater Houston joins the many national and community leaders dedicated to fighting injustices that are detriment to the health and well-being of everyone in America. We stand firmly with those fighting for their lives every day. Today, we continue that support in our conversation with Ben Hubbard, the Beirut Bureau Chief for the New York Times. He is the author of MBS, The Rise to Power of Mohammed bin Salman. Ben is an Arabic speaker with more than a decade in the Middle East. He has covered coups, civil war, protests, jihadist groups, religion, and pop culture from more than a dozen countries. Please welcome to the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, Mr. Ben Hubbard. Ben, welcome to the World Affairs Council.
And welcome you all to the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. I'm Ronan O'Malley. I'm the Director of Programs for the World Affairs Council. And I'm delighted to have a longtime Middle East expert and journalist, Ben Hubbard, the Beirut Bureau Chief for the New York Times. He spent many, many years all across the Middle East and fluent in Arabic. And in the course of writing this book, he's spent over 6 years and hundreds of interviews putting together with many, many Saudis, largely inside of Saudi Arabia, but also those he might have had to interview outside of the country. So I wanted to thank you, Felicia, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining us. And if you haven't got it already, Ben's book, MBS, is excellent. MBS, The Rise to Power of Mohammed bin Salman. I think a lot of us over the last 5 years, when he was kind of unknown, might have known a few things or read this article or that article about a few of the things MBS has done, or Mohammed bin Salman, as he's known. To become MBS. But I think Ben's book is excellent, putting together his entire, basically his family's background, where he came from, and really his rise to power and what he did and what he has done since then, since coming to power. Is quite fascinating to see it all in one place. But Ben, I just thought maybe before we start, I think a lot of people have different ideas about Saudi Arabia. Some of them are accurate, some of them are not. But perhaps two of the ways that Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS, has really shaken up the country are in terms of how the country is ruled, and then also the influence of Wahhabism and the clerics, the religious authorities in the country. So maybe just to start with the Wahhabists and the clerical influence in the country. Mohammed bin Salman himself said there was no such thing as Wahhabism, and others have said the country became much more conservative since 1979 with the attack on the Grand Mosque and obviously the Iranian Revolution. But the country has always been a conservative and traditional country. It did perhaps become more so because the government felt it had to make those people, their conservative elements or their populace happy. But can you talk about, even going back to the 1700s, the rise of Wahhab and Wahhabism and how it has shaped Saudi Arabia today?
Well, there's a founding alliance at the history of the Saudi dynasty, which, as you mentioned, goes back to the 1700s, when you had I think he's the great grandfather of MBS, who was sort of a chieftain in central Arabia. This is long before anything close to Saudi Arabia as a country existed. and formed an alliance while he was expanding with a sort of an outcast cleric, somebody who'd actually been chased out of his home village because he was seen as too extreme and was criticizing local practices, and named Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. And so this is where, and so they form an alliance where basically the Al Saud family handles the political side of things, and the Abdul Wahhabs and then his descendants would handle the religious side of things. And so they were very much in charge of kind of overseeing political life, social life, religious life, trying to make sure that the way that life was practiced in the Arabian Peninsula, and the way that Islam was practiced, sort of lived up to their very exacting standards. And I say that even into the 20th century, when, anyway, fast forward a bit, 1932, the modern kingdom of Saudi Arabia is founded by Mohammed bin Salman's grandfather. He resurrects this alliance with the descendants of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and makes it part of the modern country of Saudi Arabia that we know now. So this has been a huge part of the country's history going back hundreds of years. It's one of the reasons that the place is so conservative. Culturally, it would have been conservative as well, but sort of this alliance between the royal family and somebody who very much, created one of the most, certainly conservative and I would say austere interpretations of Islam that's applied anywhere in the world on a large scale. It really very much shaped the character of Saudi Arabia. And I would say this goes up until, sort of talk about 1979, we can get into that later, but that this goes right up, I would say, until pretty much 2014, when, women couldn't drive. There were no movie theaters. There were no concerts. The arts were somewhat frowned upon. If you were a painter or something like that, you would kind of keep it to yourself, and maybe you would have private expositions, but it's not something that the government was going to be excited about sponsoring. Lots of restrictions on women, as I said, religious police, these, patrolling public places, keeping women and men who are not related from mixing with each other and interacting in ways that they deemed inappropriate. And this is one of the, I think inside of the kingdom, this is one of the major things that Mohammed bin Salman has changed. He very much has moved away from that extremely austere application of Wahhabism and of this interpretation of Islam. So now, this many years later, moving from when his father became king in 2015 until now, Saudi Arabia is a very different place. Now, a young woman can go and get a driver's license and buy a car, drive herself to work. She can work in all kinds of different professions that her mother and grandmother probably would have never dreamed of working in. Women's universities have grown over the years. So that I think for people who visit Saudi Arabia very often, and Saudis themselves, these have been some of the most noticeable changes in the kingdom.
And I suppose also it's important to note, over the course of history, the term the divine right of kings is applied across many countries and many continents, but in reality, in the modern era, probably hasn't played as much a role in a lot of monarchies. But in Saudi Arabia, the alliance with Wahhabists, like you mentioned, was a way of affirming and legitimizing their power. And I suppose that is something that MBS risks upsetting. But I suppose he judged the population had liberalized enough that it was no longer necessary.
I mean, before MBS, the model was basically that Saudi Arabia's argument, I think, both to itself, to its own people, and to the rest of the Muslim world, was that we do Islam right. We do it better than anybody else. Our version is correct, and that involves keeping women from driving. That involves all these other things, and because we are the custodians of the two holy mosques, because we have Mecca and Medina, some of the holy sites of Islam, people sort of to that and say, okay, they are leaders in the religion, and MBS has not sort of spoken directly about any kind of breakdown in that alliance or anything like that. I think he's very cautious of sort of doing it directly, but the changes in social life have been very, very dramatic. I think it's one of the big questions. So far, there has been remarkably little pushback. I mean, if you were to go back before 2015 and poll Saudi experts and ask them, is it possible that a young crown prince could come in and get rid of the religious police and open up movie theaters and concerts and bring the Backstreet Boys to perform for young people? Do you think that's possible? I think most of them would have said, no, that's crazy. And that's exactly what happened. And so far, we've seen very little pushback from the conservatives. I think the fear before was that, these people had broad support inside of society, that they were sort of a strong, that they could have organized opposition to any move to sort of change these aspects of the way that Islam was practiced in Saudi Arabia. Up until now, we've seen very little. Some of this is because there's been, significant, I would say, authoritarian force used against them. There were There's been arrest campaigns of a number of them who did not get with the program. They've put in jail, put on trial, given warnings, given house arrest, various things. And that send a message to, I think, the wider community of conservatives to let them know, if you're not on board with the program, then you should be quiet, or you might have to pay a price for that. So I think that's part of it. There's a demographic issue. Saudi Arabia is a profoundly young country. There are about 30 million people in Saudi Arabia. About 22 million of them are Saudi citizens. The rest are foreign workers. Roughly two thirds of Saudi citizens are under age 30. And, these are young people who in many ways are, incredibly plugged into the rest of the world. And some of them carry multiple cell phones and they have multiple Twitter accounts. And for a while, and perhaps still, they were, the world's largest consumers of YouTube. Many of them watch the same stuff on Netflix that you and I watch. And there's also an aspect of, this younger generation of Saudis kind of understanding their relationship with the rest of the world in a way that older Saudis did not, when the kingdom was a much more isolated sort of place from the rest of the world. And so I think that's one thing that, I think MBS, for one, recognized that this traditional Saudi Arabia wasn't exactly where he wanted to live, and it probably wasn't where a lot of these younger Saudis wanted to live. And so many of these changes have directly appealed to, I would say, a large group of this younger demographic of Saudis as well.
And then the other area where he's, I suppose, completely kind of altered the tradition is, since its founding in the 1930s, King Abdulaziz, all the way through the, current King Salman, Saudi Arabia has always been an absolute monarchy, where a monarch was the final ultimate authority. But perhaps one of the big differences was that traditionally, all of the kings, they would kind of give pockets of control, or at least delegation of authority, whether it be for the energy industry, the military, the police, or regional governments, to a lot of the other princes who would say their brothers or half brothers. But that was a tradition, so that sometimes often consensus was used, even if it wasn't needed, to come to agreements traditionally in how Saudi Arabia was run. I mean, is that a fairly accurate assessment?
Yeah, and I think, Saudi Arabia was, it's since its founding has been an absolute monarchy, and it's still one of the few absolute monarchies in the world. But before 2015, there was sort of this idea, sort of an unofficial council of princes. There was nothing official, but you had these kind of senior members of the royal family, senior princes, sons of the founding king, who would kind of divide up the major portfolios among themselves. So you would have one prince in his branch of the family in charge of foreign affairs, somebody else running the National Guard, someone else doing the defense ministry and the military, and other people sort of spaced out, as you mentioned, in the governorships, for sort of like the provincial governors in different parts of Saudi Arabia. And for the big decisions, they would sort of meet and discuss, and there was kind of this sense of consensus that would be reached under the king. And sure, it was the king's decision in the end, but there was this much more of an informal consensus system inside of the family. What we've seen since Mohammed bin Salman came in is very much a consolidation. A lot of this kind of power sharing or consensus has been pushed out. Many of these older princes who were around for quite a long time have been effectively neutralized as political forces in the kingdom. Some of them were locked up. There was, people remember this famous lockup at the Ritz-Carlton in 2017, where a number of princes and some of the kingdom's, most prominent business people and wealthiest people were locked in the Riyadh Ritz-Carlton, accused of corruption. Many of them had large portions of their assets taken away. This neutralized certain people from kind of that level of society, and they've pretty much been replaced by people who report to Mohammed bin Salman. So instead of having this kind of, general sort of informal council, we have, really everything going back to the top of Mohammed bin Salman. Obviously, King Salman is still the king, and he has the ultimate decision. But, I think on a day-to-day basis, everybody considers Mohammed bin Salman the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. I mean, everything goes back to him, and he's involved in all of these big decisions.
And perhaps maybe as briefly as you can. It's because it's not a short story, but it is a fascinating story. As you point out in the book, the founder, King Abdulaziz, had, I think, 18 wives. He had 63 known children, I think 36 boys and 27 girls. So the idea 10 years ago that Mohammed bin Salman would be the crown prince and the presumed next leader of Saudi Arabia was very unlikely. I think, as you note, his father was the 25th son, I think, and MBS himself was only the 6th son of the 25th son. So briefly, could you talk about how it was that he came to power through, some ways through good fortune of things that happened, but also through his own maneuvering and kind of often wise, but sometimes Machiavellian tactics.
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, if you could go back to 2014 and poll Saudi experts, maybe 2014, some of them had sort of figured out that Mohammed bin Salman was on his way up. But if for a very long time, people who were sort of watching the royal family and trying to figure out who were the princes who were likely to sort of come up and become the next crown prince, maybe get in line for king eventually, Mohammed bin Salman was on very few people's lists. I mean, he was not somebody who was, his father was just sequentially down the list of the sons of the founder near the bottom. So, he had to basically wait for all of his older brothers and half brothers to pass away before he would get his shot to be king. And then MBS has 5 older brothers, and many of them, from King Salman's first wife, many of them have much more impressive resumes than Mohammed bin Salman. These are people who, one of them was the first Arab astronaut, flew on the space shuttle Discovery. They people who, founded investment companies, ran media companies. One of them has a PhD from Oxford. I mean, these are people that have, conventionally quite impressive resumes. MBS doesn't really have any of that. He graduated from university in Riyadh, never studied abroad for any significant period of time, never really spent time abroad, never learned to speak a foreign language, including English, even conversationally until sometime in his late 30s. But what he did do is stick incredibly close to his father. So while sort of King Salman spent about 50 years as the governor of Riyadh, which was started as kind of a small city and then expanded into the Saudi capital that we know today. And, despite being, somewhere down the totem pole, had a lot of status in the royal family because he was one of the sons of the founder and because he was running the capital city. He was, the disciplinarian of the family. So whenever princes or princesses would get in trouble here or there, it was Salman who would intervene and, at some point even locking, errant princes up in a sort of a private prison that he ran. So MBS very much sticks by his father while his older half brothers are sort of going around the world getting foreign degrees and accumulating credentials. MBS sticks very, very close to his father and develops this incredibly tight relationship with them. And that is sort of where it begins because, when Salman becomes king, he can choose whoever he wants as his crown prince. I mean, that's his right as the king to choose. And he chose MBS. And, the only reason that makes sense is because of the very strong relationship with him. And I think there's very good reason to believe that he also felt that MBS had a similar outlook to him in the direction that he felt that the kingdom needed to go. Once MBS sort of gets chosen by his father, then I think his own attributes take over. And in the way that he sort of, moved his way up the royal family, eliminated rivals, sort of neutralized people who could have posed a challenge to him, there's very much, in certain cases, a very Machiavellian aspect to it. I think one of the reasons that he succeeded, there was kind of a shock and awe effect to it. I mean, the royal family, there are, generally people treat each other with a certain amount of respect. They're, younger people respect older people. There's a lot of deference to authority and things like that. And, MBS did a lot of things to older relatives that, again, I think Saudi experts didn't really think that you could get away with if you were a younger prince. He locked some of them in the Ritz, put some of them under house arrest, arrested some of them outright. And, sort of gradually by doing this while restructuring parts of the government to make them report back to him, he emerges by 2017, 2018 as really the de facto ruler of the kingdom.
And, I guess, as we noted, to be given, placed in charge of one ministry or one agency would be not uncommon for a prince. His father made him the defense minister at age 29, despite the fact that he'd never served in the military. Right. But in relatively short succession, can you talk about how, through his own, I suppose, methods and also with his father's obviously, obliging, he was put in charge of virtually every important industry in the country, energy industry, the National Guard, the police, the defense ministry.
Well, I mean, his father gave him these portfolios. He was named the defense minister soon after Salman became king in early 2015, and very shortly after launched the Saudi military into a military intervention in Yemen, and they're still there now. It's a 5-year-old quagmire where the Saudis have not made a huge amount of progress in trying to achieve what they wanted the Yemen to do. He was put in charge of the Aramco board, overseeing the economic crown jewel of the kingdom, overseeing oil policy. Came up with the idea that there was going to be an Aramco IPO to raise money. The security services were also restructured in a way that made them report to him instead of reporting to another prince. And, just kind of, all these different jobs, it really just kind of funneled all the control of the big branches of power inside of Saudi Arabia up to him.
And I suppose, maybe just to kind of turn to one of the other aspects of his personality that stands out. Obviously, he's a very hard worker, like his father, perhaps unlike some of the other princes. Obviously has a good intelligence and is thought to be a quick study in a lot of different things. But could you talk about perhaps what is seen as maybe the biggest potential risk is his kind of rush to judgment, or just kind of the tendency to make, brash, kind of hurried decisions, whether it be the, Qatar crisis or the kidnapping of Prime Minister Hariri of Lebanon, or, sadly, what happened with Jamal Khashoggi.
I mean, MBS is very much a disruptor. You hear this term sort of in business and entrepreneurship of somebody who sort of comes and disrupts the system. And this is very much what he's done in a lot of ways. He did not feel bound. I think it's quite clear by the conventions of the way that things had been done in the past, or the way that his elders had done them. He very much sort of wanted to break the mold and come up with something else. And this, in a lot of ways, has led to some incredibly rash decisions that I think have, raised a lot of questions, certainly in the United States, and I think other countries, certainly around the Middle East, about his judgment. Some of these things have been quite interesting. The fact that he was willing to sort of go head to head with the religious establishment, or take the power to arrest away from the religious police, or snap his fingers and say, we're going to let women drive. I mean, these are obviously, I think most people would argue, benefits for the kingdom in the long run. But he doesn't like the political setup of Lebanon, or what Saudi Arabia has gotten from its political alliances in Lebanon. So they basically arrest the prime minister and force him to resign, thinking that this is going to shake things up. It ends up becoming sort of a huge international embarrassment. That prime minister, Saad Hariri, eventually goes back to his job, becomes prime minister, loses some seats in the election, and doesn't really change anything in the way that Lebanon functions. It just sort of ends up, I would say, embarrassing the Saudis, embarrassing Saad Hariri, and making him, a little bit less effective at doing what they would want him to do anyway. The Ritz, I think, was another thing that, the Saudis said this is a big, corruption is a big problem in the kingdom. We're going to hit them very hard. We're going to go after the corrupt people all the way up to the princes. And, everybody, I think, agrees that if Saudi Arabia is going to get its budget under control, you've got to deal with corruption. But, the question is the right way to do it to suddenly lock up about somewhere around 400 people in the Riyadh Ritz-Carlton and take their money away and sort of, negotiate settlements with them that involves, them handing over what you think they took, illegally from the state or from the government. So, well, I think a lot of people international businessmen, and, trying to decide whether it's a good idea to get involved in Saudi Arabia might be a bit uncomfortable with that way of dealing with corruption. These were not handled in court. They were not the laws that were used to decide who owed what the whole process was extremely opaque. More recently, certainly plenty of people, and I'm sure plenty of people in Houston had questions about, the recent oil war with Russia. Where did this come from, and why did Saudi Arabia, at the beginning of what was even then clear to be some kind of a global pandemic — I don't think we quite realized it was going to be as bad as it is now, but it was pretty clear things were going to go south with the economy. Was this really the right time to launch an oil war with Russia that's going to crash the global oil price? And but it doesn't appear that there was a huge amount of strategy that went into that decision, or that there was, it just seems to be that he got mad that he couldn't get the Russians to agree to the cuts that he wanted, and felt that this was the way to sort of get back at them. So we've seen, we've kind of seen this rashness. And when I was doing interviews for the book in Washington and, other Western capitals, this is really the question that people were asking is, okay, the guy is still young. He is, now he's 34. If he lives to be the same age as his father, if he becomes king and he lives to be the same age as his father, he could be king into the 2060s, which, if you look at sort of compare that to the American political system, who knows what the US is going to look like in 2060. So, but the question is he learning from his mistakes? Is he, does he look back at some of these things and say, wow, yeah, that thing didn't really work out the way that we wanted it to, or, ooh, we could have done that better, or certainly the case, obviously, you mentioned the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, that, this was such kind of a stain on how he had wanted to portray himself to the world as this reformer and somebody who's giving women rights and doing these things. And, then some of his agents go and murder a journalist in a foreign country. That's a stain that's going to be there for quite a while.
And you mentioned United States and energy. Obviously, the United States has a decades-long alliance interaction with Saudi Arabia. Oil and energy is a huge part of that. America's increasing energy independence, with fracking and other methods, has perhaps aided in maybe our outlook towards the Middle East and maybe reducing our dependence on Middle East and oil. But they're still going to set global oil prices in a lot of ways. But to look at how American presidents have approached Saudi Arabia, they all have realized the necessity of a strong relationship with the Saudis in the region for oil prices and stability from that side, but also for us. They're a huge buyer of billions of dollars worth of arms every year. Obama himself, I think, signed tens of billions, $60 billion worth of arms deals with the Saudis. But could you maybe talk about the other ways in which Obama's perception of the Saudis, especially the spread of Wahhabism and religious intolerance, and his views of the Saudis was so different to Trump, someone that the Saudis initially probably would have been very alarmed about from the campaign trail in 2016, when he's saying Muslims hate us, and then they're calling for a ban of people coming from Muslim majority countries, to where the relationship is now. Can you talk about the kind of polar opposites of those two relationships?
Yeah, I mean, the Saudis were not happy with Obama. I think that's safe to say, and there are a number of reasons for it. I think the two that sort of stand out when you look back at the history of the Obama administration were, first, they were very frustrated with the way that the Obama administration handled the uprisings of the Arab Spring. So when you had first Tunisia and then Egypt, and especially the fact that Obama came out and basically said that Hosni Mubarak of Egypt should step down because of these mass protests against his rule. I think for the Saudis, they just felt like, this guy has been an American ally for decades, and all of a sudden you're saying he's got to leave power? Well, what kind of an ally are you? So they were quite angry with that. Syria, I think the Saudis had hoped that there would be a much more forceful intervention on the part of the United States to try to get rid of Bashar al-Assad. That clearly didn't happen, and he's still there. So that sort of set things off. There were, as well as, what you mentioned, there were comments that Obama made about how he saw Wahhabism being playing a destructive role in the world. I think in one of his interviews, he talked about Indonesia and, how sort of Saudi clerics had, by sort of bringing Saudi teachings to Indonesia, had kind of hardened the interpretation of Islam that was there, and criticized that. That's certainly something that Saudis would not be happy to hear. And then you get to the Iran deal. I mean, that was really kind of the big thing that ticked them off. It was, the Saudis, when they look around the region, the scariest thing for them is Iran. They look at Iran and, this is a country that doesn't have the same resources that Saudi has in terms of finance and in terms of sort of military hardware, but it's managed to sort of extend its arms throughout all of these different countries around Saudi Arabia. And so this is the Saudis see this as a major security threat. And then, they suddenly realize that the Obama administration had been holding covert talks with the Iranians. John Kerry had been meeting with his Iranian counterpart to try to come up with a deal about the Iranian nuclear program. And so there was very much a sense of betrayal, I think, in Saudi Arabia and in many of the other Gulf countries, that, here we've been good partners with you for so long, and here you do go behind our back and you're trying to make a deal with kind of our arch enemy. So that clearly didn't help out. And I think that bitterness stuck around until the end of the Obama administration. Remarkably, the Saudis' relationship with the Trump administration is incredibly different from what anybody would have expected. So if you go back to the campaign and you look at the kinds of rhetoric that Trump was using about the Saudis, about the Gulf, and sometimes about Islam in general, it was really not very nice. I mean, he was, saying terrible things about Muslims, and even before the campaign. One of the debates with Hillary Clinton, I mean, he even uses the Clinton Foundation's relationship with Gulf countries as sort of a cudgel to beat her with, and says, like, how are you doing business with these terrible people? And, I think the Saudis, like many other people, were quite surprised when Trump won the election. And then something really remarkable happens, because I think, again, if you had polled the experts, they would have told you, like, no, there's no way that the Saudis are going to have a relationship with Trump. Look at the way that he's talked about them. And so anyway, the Saudis, they did a quite smart thing that I think ended up being, almost one of the most significant successes of the Mohammed bin Salman era, certainly in terms of foreign affairs. They sent a delegation to the East Coast soon after the election. They met with a bunch of Trump's business associates, political associates, members of the Republican Party who knew Trump quite well. They met with Jared Kushner and they wrote up a report, basically a profile of the incoming administration. And they said, these people are not professional politicians. They're deal makers. They're business people. They're interested in the bottom line. They don't really know much about the Middle East. What they do know about in the Middle East is Israel, and that's what they really care about. And then the Saudis kind of built their appeal to the Trump administration on this profile, and it ended up being wildly successful. So successful that, unlike every previous American president who has, taken his first foreign trip abroad to one of the historic allies, Trump does it to Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis were absolutely overjoyed. They throw this, huge event where they invite leaders from all across the Muslim world to come. And that sort of lays the groundwork for this very, very tight relationship between the Saudi leadership and the Trump administration that I think endures to this day. And once, we start getting to some of the, I would say, riskier things that Mohammed bin Salman has done, what we've seen repeatedly is that the Trump administration has been kind of a firewall around Mohammed bin Salman when it comes to criticism from other people in the United States and other people in Washington. The Trump administration has repeatedly stood up for Mohammed bin Salman and for the relationship with the Saudis in a way that has made it very difficult for other branches of the US government to really push back against things they didn't like that the Saudis were doing.
And maybe just one or two more questions, and then we'll just turn to the audience. But I think your book does an excellent job of kind of portraying the last few years of the life of Jamal Khashoggi and what he went through and who actually was. Yes, he was pious and conservative and had been a supporter of Muslim Brotherhood, but he was never advocated for violence. His support of the Muslim Brotherhood was, in essence, I suppose, the idea of political ability for the people to be part of the political process, and that if a lot of people are religious, and Islam should be part of the political process. But I think what you point out very, importantly, is that there will never get an actual smoking gun of, MBS ordering somebody to go and kill and dismember him at the consulate in Istanbul. But what is true, and you point out, is that no matter what, at a minimum, he created the atmosphere and the framework in which his key deputies would have felt, at a minimum, this is something that he would have approved of and would have thought was all right to do. And perhaps that's really the greatest condemnation. Could you talk more about that?
Well, what we saw leading up to, I think first, people who didn't follow Saudi Arabia closely probably didn't know much about Jamal Khashoggi before he was killed. The thing to know about Khashoggi is that by the time he was killed in 2018, he was in his late 50s. And so, if you look at sort of his entire life, he had spent decades basically being a part of the Saudi establishment. He was in effect kind of a state journalist. He edited Saudi newspapers. He wrote for Saudi newspapers. He was close to sort of both an official and an unofficial advisor to a number of Saudi princes. He traveled with them. He traveled with kings. And when I started covering Saudi Arabia in 2013, I did the same thing that most of my colleagues who had come before me covering Saudi Arabia did, is that one of the first things that you did was get Jamal Khashoggi's phone number, so that every time Saudi Arabia did something and you were trying to figure out what are they thinking, what does this mean, how do we understand this, you would call him up, and Jamal was somebody who would answer his phone and would tell you, well, I think the king is worried about this, and I think he's thinking about this. And he very much played this role of sort of communicating with the West what the Saudis were thinking and what they were doing and what they wanted to do. And that's who he was really up until MBS comes to the fore. And then sort of once you have, the kind of authoritarian strain of MBS's behavior become very apparent, Jamal leaves. He was very critical of it. He was worried when a number of his friends got arrested. He had sort of gotten warnings that he could be next on the list. So he leaves. He goes to, lives outside of Washington, D.C., sets up there, and then starts writing for the Washington Post and gets increasingly critical, writes a number of very critical things of, critical pieces of what Mohammed bin Salman is doing. And that's just too much. At the same time, to understand what happens to Jamal, you also have to take a broader view of the way that MBS had been dealing with dissidents. There was really an orchestrated campaign to kind of increase the pressure on these people to, anybody who was a Saudi who was speaking out in a way that didn't sort of line up with the message would have a price to pay. And so, the leadership really pursued everything from sort of going after people on social media, manipulating social media in some cases just to try to get criticisms off of social media. Certainly on Twitter, there was a lot of, sort of effort invested there. You have phone hacking scandals of, the Saudis appearing to get inside the cell phones of Saudi dissidents who are outside the country and talking about them in the ways that they don't like. And then you have sort of more activist steps, people getting arrested. There are a number of people who were actually arrested abroad, basically effectively kidnapped and dragged back to Saudi Arabia. In the context of that, Jamal, what happened to Jamal is very much kind of the summit. He was much more prominent, and certainly more prominent in the West than all these other people. And, I think it was, as you said, I think it was in the context of this atmosphere that had been created where you just do not criticize what the Crown Prince is doing, that, these agents felt that, we're going to take this guy out because he's talking about our ruler in a way that we're not going to take.
And I suppose, related to that, maybe just before we turn over to the audience, MBS has proposed incredible, social and economic reform, completely restructuring the economy, in a number of years, perhaps, whether it happens or not, we'll have to see. But the one area where there's been essentially no reform and no indication of reform is in politics. There are minor councils in the country or municipal elections of some sort, but it's still an absolute monarchy. And as you point out throughout the book, becoming increasingly authoritarian. Can you talk about, I suppose, what it's like, even just say for the average Saudis, the people who aren't in the headlines, the people who maybe no longer use social media or afraid to look at a tweet or respond to something, or afraid to email a friend or call people because they know their cell phones are probably monitored or the social media is monitored. What it's like in terms of how the day-to-day life of typical Saudis has changed. And then maybe, on top of that, what it's like for the few people who might have kind of stepped up to protest or ask for reform.
I mean, it's very hard to generalize. A country of 22 million citizens, hard to generalize and sort of what life is like. And I haven't been in Saudi Arabia since early 2018, so it's kind of hard to generalize. I mean, I don't think all Saudis are politicized. I mean, I think that there is a different culture. If you grow up in the United States where you're going to vote every 2 to 4 years, 2 years or 4 years, and sometimes more frequently than that, where there's sort of robust discussion programs on your television stations, people think and talk about politics a lot more. I mean, if you've grown up in a absolute monarchy, it's just, I think there's a lot of Saudis who are just not that interested in the politics. I think that, what you're talking about is really for the people who are. I mean, people who do want to talk about the way that the country is being run or some of the high level decisions that are being made and how that affects them. And the message has been very clear to these people that, if you agree with what's going on, if you're excited about the social reforms, if you support the economic program, go on social media, talk about how wonderful everything is, give interviews to foreign journalists, things like that. But if you have criticisms, you should probably keep them to yourself. And this goes for, I think, people on the religious side, religious conservatives who are uncomfortable about movie theaters, concerts, women driving, things like that. These people are just kind of, I'm sure that there are plenty of people in Saudi Arabia who disagree with these things, that they're underground or they're keeping it to themselves. There's other cases, there's a quite well-known entrepreneur and economist who just went on Twitter to talk about why he didn't think it was a good idea to privatize Aramco, basically saying, this is the crown jewel, this is economic crown jewel. Why should we make it public? And he was arrested and is currently on trial on terrorism charges, which I think most people outside of Saudi Arabia think are trumped up. So, there's just very much been this message, and then obviously there's the social media manipulation, which I think Saudis are quite aware of. The phone hacking scandals have made people quite nervous as well. So there's just, I think, it's much harder, certainly for outsiders, to talk to Saudis about what they think and how they feel and how, the direction of the country, because it has been very clear that if you step out of line, you could pay a price for it.
And just a last follow-up to that, I'm sure it's probably not a good comparison, and I'm sure as a Saudi, not like any comparison to a Turk, but obviously it's 30 years earlier, but you think of Ataturk, a relatively young, powerful person, obviously frugal and different in many other ways to MBS, but a massive consolidation of power, restructuring of the country, huge modernization, taking on conservatives, taking on traditional elements of society and Islam. That festered for a long time underneath Turkish society, and it may have taken decades to come to pass, but in some ways it's perhaps an element that maybe led to, say, Erdogan. Do you think there are any aspects of that in Saudi Arabia of a kind of repressed traditional and conservative values that might eventually kind of come back to create trouble for MBS?
I mean, I really don't want to get into fortune telling. I mean, who knows what's going to happen? So I don't want to sort of try to predict what will happen in Saudi Arabia. I do think that the Ataturk example is instructive. You know, this is somebody who basically came in and said, we don't want to be an Eastern backward. And these are, you know, the kinds of terms that Ataturk himself used. This is not me, you know, but we don't want to be an Eastern back. We want to be part of Europe. We're going to, you know, and he did incredibly dramatic things, you know, ending the caliphate, banning the fez, you know, saying that if you're going to wear a hat, it has to have a brim on it. I mean, incredibly intrusive things into, you know, the daily lives of average Turks, basically saying like, I'm going to drag you into what I consider modernity and I'm going to make it stick. And, you know, now, you know, this many decades later, now we have, you know, a clearly Islamist president who's restoring some of these things, bringing Islam back into public life in Turkey in a way that we haven't seen since before Ataturk. And, you know, so it's instructive because I think it shows that, you know, when these things are deep into a society, it's very difficult for a leader, no matter how powerful or momentous that person is, to just sort of snap his fingers and make it go away. I mean, you could say a singular thing about race in the United States. You know, 1860s, we had a civil war. We got rid of, you know, we got rid of slavery. 1960s, we had a civil rights movement. We had civil rights acts. But here we are in 2020, and like these things keep popping up because they're deep in the society. And so, you know, I think the only thing that I would say in sort of applying those comparisons to Saudi Arabia would be when something like Wahhabism has been such a part of Saudi society for so long, you know, that it goes back embedded in the ruling structure, you know, really for 300 years. And when it's been, you know, for the 20th century, you know, taught in the schools, exported abroad, preached at the mosques, spread on television, the idea that sort of one ruler can come and kind of snap his fingers and make it go away, you know, you can sort of take it off TV and whatever, but it's so deep in society that I think it's just hard to believe that it's going to go away. How it's going to manifest itself or pop up in various places is very hard to predict, and I wouldn't really want to get into that. But I'm sure that there's aspects of this still various places in Saudi Arabia, and we'll just have to see kind of, you know, how it comes up in the future.
And just related to that, from our audience, Jamil asks, unlike the current rulers of the Middle East, MBS is not Western educated. How and why was he able to see the kingdom ready for the reforms that were more closely related to Western lifestyles?
I mean, I think, you know, as I said before, I think he was connected to the West in the way that a lot of young Saudis were. You know, he was watching TV and playing video games and reading comic books and things like that. And, you know, Saudi Arabia used to be quite an isolated place, and it used to be a place where, you know, people were sort of connected to Saudi Arabia and didn't travel abroad much. I mean, it was a bit different in the Hijaz, the area around Mecca and Medina, because of all the pilgrims. But Central Arabia was still, you know, for most of the 20th century, quite an isolated place. And that changes obviously with MBS's generation because of the internet, because of satellite television. And so, you know, I think, you know, he didn't need to sort of, you know, get a degree from a university in the United States or whatever to sort of recognize those parts of Western culture that he was interested in. I think he got it from watching TV. I mean, he did definitely travel in the West. And I think he just sort of looked, you know, he's spoken in a very complimentary fashion about the titans of Silicon Valley, and just saying, you know, just watching Bill Gates and, you know, these people, I learned all these things from them. And so I think, you know, that he was, you know, still able to sort of recognize parts of American culture and Western culture that he wanted to sort of bring aspects of into Saudi Arabia, even though I don't think he had a vast personal experience with it.
All right, thanks. Just another question from the audience, just something people might have heard about. Karen asks, could you talk about what's going on with Princess Mohammed bin Salman? Is she in confinement or house arrest? And as you kind of note in the book, MBS, it's hard to fully corroborate it, but is believed to have had his mother under house arrest for a few years until recently, and his sister and his brother. Could you talk about the levels he would go to even with his own family?
Yeah, I mean, the MBS manages the royal family, I think, in the way that he believes that he needs to accomplish what he wants to do. And in many cases, this involves locking people up. I talk about in the book that there are both, members of the royal family and people in the U.S. government who were quite sure that he had placed his own mother under effective house arrest, basically locked her up in a palace for a while. Nobody's quite sure exactly what brought it about, but she was not going to family functions and things like that. But for whatever reason, he decided that was the right thing to do, even with his own mother. There have been numbers of other sort of princesses and some princesses who have been arrested either because, they got involved in things that MBS didn't like. Some of them were criticizing him in, more private settings, I would say, for things that he had done. the specific princess that you asked about, she's a daughter of the second king of Saudi Arabia. You know, somebody spent a good amount of time living in London, and you know, used to go on TV. She would do interviews with the BBC and other channels and sort of talk about what she thought about what was happening in Saudi Arabia. And from what we know, I mean, you know, the Saudi government has never commented on why she was arrested, but sounds like she just kind of got out of line. They didn't like the fact that this, you know, this princess was off talking publicly about what she thought should happen in Saudi Arabia, so they locked her up. I don't know. I haven't sort of asked in recent weeks, but I don't have any reason to believe that she has been released.
All right. I suppose a few people asking relatively similar questions, say when it comes to OPEC, and you know, you mentioned obviously MBS's kind of rash decision in his failed negotiations with Putin, and the crash of oil prices that didn't need any more help with the economy, global demand already crashing from COVID-19. Oliver asks, have relations between Saudi Arabia and other OPEC plus members been seriously dented? You know, countries like Nigeria or Mexico, where they are not able to cope with the massive decline in oil prices and revenues.
Sorry, what was I missed the first part of the question.
I suppose asking if his kind of, you know, brash decisions with regards to, you know, oil production, you know, if he, you know, crashing the price of oil here earlier in the year, has that affected his relationship with other OPEC plus countries who obviously can't take these wild swings of revenue in a way that he could, or the Saudis could? Yeah,
I mean, oil, to be honest, is not my specialty. I'm sure there are people on the call who know more about the oil markets than I do. I mean, I would imagine that they were all not very happy about this. I mean, Saudi Arabia can do this and survive because of the size of its oil industry and because it's an incredibly low cost producer. You know, they can get oil out of the ground for, I think, a few dollars a barrel compared, you know, with other countries, including the U.S. It costs much more to do that. So yeah, I'm sure that a lot of these countries are not happy about it, but there's sort of, they have limited ability to sort of push back against Saudi Arabia because of the role that it plays in, you know, in OPEC and OPEC plus and just in the global market in general. So, you know, I would imagine that, you know, certainly oil producers in your neck of the woods were not extremely happy with the way that things went either.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good point. And I'll just, another question from Nashad asks, we constantly hear experts say that it's in our national interest to support this regime. We are energy independent now, so why is it in our interest in supporting them regardless of how they behave? I guess more broadly, do you expect U.S., whoever the president might be come January, that the United States will continue this strong alliance with the Saudis, kind of regardless of what they do, especially maybe with regards to human rights?
I mean, there are a number of arguments that you hear I mean, I'm not a policymaker, I can't really give policy recommendations, but the arguments that you hear for maintaining a relationship with Saudi Arabia, you know, you have sort of the, you know, President Trump has been very clear that what his view is that, you know, the Saudis are important to us because they are key partners of ours for what we want to do in the Middle East, so we don't want to neglect the relationship. They also spend a huge amount of money on American weapons, which provides American jobs. And so, you know, we obviously don't want to jeopardize that. He said many times, if we don't sell weapons to the Saudis, they're going to go buy them from the Russians. And how is that in our interest? You know, plenty of other people would argue that even though the U.S. is energy independent and, you know, we're so much less reliant on oil from Saudi Arabia and from the Persian Gulf than we were historically, it's still in the U.S. interest to keep global oil markets stable because we are an active member of the world economy. And that, you know, having sort of chaos in the oil markets creates chaos in the markets, which affects American imports, exports, and sort of our ability to interact with the global economy. So, you know, I think, you know, that argument is just basically that, you know, we need that relationship so that we can, you know, make sure that they're using their hand on the lever in a way that sort of helps us run our economy the way that we like. You know, there are plenty of there's a lot of, you know, sort of, we think a lot, and I think even in the book, I focus a lot on sort of the top level relationship between the president and the king and, you know, Mohammed bin Salman and people in the White House. There's a huge number of things right below that because this relationship has been around for a long time. You know, weapons sales, they're not just sort of, you buy a jet and I give you a jet and it's your jet to fly around, you know, until you get tired of it and then you go buy another jet. No, these things come with sort of long-term maintenance contracts. They come with training. You know, you have large numbers of Saudi pilots, Saudi military cadres who come to the United States, spend time on U.S. military bases for training, things like that. You have military people who train people in Saudi Arabia. There's security cooperation between the intelligence services. And so, there's plenty of other people who would argue that, like, even when things break down in the relationship, these kind of things in the bilateral relationship are valuable and we should stick to them. On the flip side, you definitely have other people who say, these guys are bad actors and we should use the leverage that we have because of our relationship to try to rein them in on some of the human rights violations and on things that we don't, things that we don't like. There are not many precedents, I would say, in American history, not under Republicans nor Democrats, for doing that. But there are certainly people who argue that the United States should do more of that.
And related to that, I know you're not a U.S. political expert, but I'll ask: would a President Biden, if elected, likely pursue a less friendly relationship with MBS as Saudi Arabia? And if so, how might Saudi Arabia react?
Well, I have to stay out of the fortune-telling business, unfortunately, because as I described with Trump, I think we've all been surprised at how his relationship with Saudi Arabia worked out, and so I just don't want to sort of fall into that trap. What I could say is that there has been a lot of anger in various parts of the U.S. government at things that Mohammed bin Salman has done. This has come up in Congress. You've had bipartisan pushes to try to stop arms sales, which have been vetoed by the White House. Plenty of people in the State Department were not happy about, the forced resignation of Saad Hariri in Lebanon. Plenty of people in the Defense Department are, quite uncomfortable with the way that the war in Yemen has gone and how American weaponry has been used there and, American training, things like that. If you look at the statements from Biden, he's been quite critical of the Saudis. He's talked about no longer, I think in one of his platform, he put out his platform for American Muslims, and he very clearly says, no more blank check for Saudi Arabia on human rights abuses. So that's something. And I do think that certainly because of the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, there is kind of a stain on the Saudis that they're going to struggle to deal with. In 2018, Mohammed bin Salman came to the United States, took this remarkable trip where he met everybody. He went to Washington, he went to New York and met finance people. He went to Seattle and met Bill Gates. He went to Silicon Valley and met Mark Zuckerberg. He went to Hollywood and met Rupert Murdoch. And, all these people
came here and
really
opened a refinery. So, yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And he had lunch with, 2 former President Bushes. I mean, that's, not all of us can do that. And so, if he were to make that kind of trip today, I don't know how many of these people would make room in their schedule for him. I think it would be much more difficult. And I think, not a lot of people, certainly not as many people would be willing to have photo ops with Mohammed bin Salman right now. Whether that applies to Biden, it is at this point, I would say, a bit difficult to imagine a President Biden, should he win the election, kind of having a photo op with Mohammed bin Salman in the White House. But who knows? We never thought, I probably wouldn't have thought that would happen with Trump either. So we'll just have to wait and see.
And we've touched upon it. You talk about a lot more in the book, but Yemen, obviously, probably the greatest humanitarian crisis and disaster of the last few years, especially since the war in Syria has at least reached a degree of a stalemate. But related to that, I have 2 questions. Barbara asks, why do the Saudis appear to be so averse to negotiating a settlement in Yemen? And Joel asks, just this week, it appears that drones and missiles were sent to Riyadh. Is Saudi Arabia trying to get out of Yemen? MBS, at least perhaps maybe, seems to have come to the realization that Yemen has not gone well. It maybe took them a while to come to that conclusion. But do you see them having an end game? And also, obviously, the U.S. role in being their major military supplier is a large black eye for us as well.
Yeah, I think the Saudis are in a pickle in Yemen. I mean, I think it's a difficult situation for them. I think when you look at the way that they talked about it, I mean, I think, again, you had a young crown prince, or he wasn't crown prince yet, but you had a young prince come in, made defense minister. And I think he sort of said, we've been spending these tens of billions of dollars on, fighter jets and smart bombs and artillery, and we've never really used them. Why are we going to let this sort of scrappy militant group in Yemen take over the capital city and threaten us and open, relations with Iran? Like, no, we're going to go after them. And so he launches this military intervention. And at the time, Saudi officials were telling people in Washington, oh, we'll wrap it up in a few weeks. This is going to be very quick. And, it became clear very quickly that they didn't have the capabilities to do that. And so we have this bizarre picture of, after 5 years, this quite unsophisticated militant group that doesn't really have significant foreign backing. It has a relationship with Iran, but there's no reason to believe that Iran is shipping them huge quantities of weapons or of money. they've managed to sort of hold off, one of the, probably the largest military spender in the Arab world for 5 years. And now the front lines have been stable for quite a while. Nobody's really making any progress. You've had huge humanitarian suffering, cholera outbreaks and civilian deaths and all sorts of other terrible things. Now, of course, we're worried about coronavirus. There are indications now that the Saudis would like to find a way to wrap this up. I think part of the problem is that they haven't yet found what they can offer the Houthis, who are this, the group that has taken over the capital, in order to get them to come to the table. The Houthis, these are guys who are very good at fighting. They're not particularly good at politics. I think they sort of say, here we are running the capital city. Nobody can get rid of us. Why should we sit down and sort of negotiate our way out of power in this part of the country? And so I think if there is going to be a resolution to this, it's not going to come through military means. That's become very clear. And somebody's going to have to figure out an offer that you can make to the Houthis to get them to give up what they've managed to accomplish militarily. And so far, nobody has really found the formula for that. I don't think the U.S. has been particularly engaged in pushing on this. Certainly, there are diplomats in the State Department who are talking about this, but you have not seen kind of a high-level push certainly from the White House to push for peace talks in Yemen and things like that. So unfortunately, I think the war is probably going to continue to be with us in some form for a while.
And just for the sake of time, I just want to get to 3 more quick audience questions, if that's all right with you. Sure. Martha asks, do you consider Iran to be a credible threat to Saudi Arabia? Can you talk about the realities of Iran in the region, and is Saudi Arabia correct in what its assessment of Iran, or perhaps overestimating it?
Well, I think we have strategic threats, and then we have actual threats. And so I think the strategic threat, I think, is real. It has not always been actualized, and by the strategic threat, I mean that Iran, which is a Farsi nation that represents a minority inside of Islam, has managed to, with sort of less resources than Saudi Arabia, build this network throughout the Arab world, where they have military partners in Iraq, military partners in Syria, very powerful military partners where I'm in Lebanon and in Hezbollah, that sort of act on the local level in ways that both help sort of broadcast Iranian power in their area. And also, these are all sort of very close partners to the Iranians. And so this is something that makes the Saudis very nervous. You have not seen, direct cases of sort of this network being, I would say, activated in a way to directly attack Saudi interests. If you put Yemen on the side, we can talk about Yemen. But I think for Saudis, it's a very serious question. I mean, it's the same, I think many other countries will look around, and when they saw a foe sort of creating these relationships in their neighboring countries, they would get quite nervous about it as well. Yemen, obviously, they're incredibly worried about the way that the Iranians have formed this alliance with the Houthis. There's, as far as we know, weapons training going on. And, this is the reason that the Houthis are able to sort of fire these rockets into Riyadh. And nobody thinks that they sort of came up with this on their own. So that's definitely a threat. I mean, we haven't seen huge casualties in Saudi Arabia because of it, but really it's it could happen that one of these missiles could hit an apartment building or hit a airport or something like that and kill a bunch of people. The clearest example that we have of an actual sort of physical threat that was carried out was against Aramco last August, when you had sort of out of the blue this somewhat remarkable and surprising drone and cruise missile attack on some of Aramco's most important facilities, and nobody saw it coming. All of the weapons that Saudi Arabia had bought, all of its sort of all of its defensive measures failed, and they basically managed to take offline one of Saudi Arabia's most important oil facilities. So that, more than anything, really shows what the Iranians are capable of if they want to do it. For fairly low investment, they can do significant damage to Saudi Arabia. So, all that's to say, I don't think it's overblown, and I think it's really a challenge to Saudi Arabia to figure out, politically, how do you push back on this network in the region, and then militarily, how do you defend yourself against these, actual threats of, potential attacks on your key facilities.
And then just quickly, I'm going to combine these 2 questions, then one last concluding question. Nadine asks, how many years will it take for the Saudis to acclimatize to the changes being put in place by MBS? And someone else had asked, is there a form of kind of a de facto social contract between the Saudi people and the government that as long as you have a job, you have money, you have security, they'll let them rule how they want? And are there threats to either of those?
Yeah, I mean, the social contract, historically has been that we will take care of you. There's, when you listen to the way that, sort of the Saudi leadership talks about its people, there's almost, a kind of paternal aspect to it that, we're going to take care of you. And, Saudis, technically have, free education and free healthcare and things like that. And, when you have some kind of an issue, you go see the local prince and he helps you out, and they host big banquets, and they, there's various ways that this kind of, the money that the royal family has trickles down into society. That contract is breaking down, and a lot of that is just because I think of, sort of the combination of the finances and the demographics. I mean, the fact that, oil used to be over $100 a barrel, but since 2014, it's been, substantially below that. They just don't have as much money as they used to fund all these things. And on the flip side, there's many, many more Saudis than there used to be. It used to be quite a small country. And so with a decent amount of oil money, you could provide these kind of services and perks to your people. But, when you now have 22 million people and all these young people graduating from universities and looking for jobs, they just can't afford it anymore, which is one of the and I think, to Mohammed bin Salman's credit, I think he's recognized this. And a lot of the reforms are trying to address this, saying, okay, we need to have people less dependent on the government, boost the private sector, invest in these other sectors that are going to create jobs. We can certainly talk about how realistic it is that they're going to be able to do this, but I think, he recognizes that this social contract is not going to work anymore because the government just can't afford it. And so he's trying to push for sort of a new, a new way of running the place. When he's been asked specifically about it, there was, I forget who it was, but there was an interview, I think it was The Economist, that asked them when they talked about sort of bringing taxes for the first time. Saudis had never paid taxes. And they said, well, in other countries, there have been revolutions based on the idea of no taxation without representation. And he sort of laughed it off and said, like, no, it's different here. And I think so far it is. But I think as the sort of perks dry up, there is a chance that there will, the perks dry up, and where Saudis are going to have to sort of work harder to support themselves and get less support from the government. It is possible that people could kind of, start seeing the social contract in a different way. In terms of how long it will take for the Saudis to adjust, it's very hard to, it's just sort of impossible to predict these things. On the surface, I think it's been quite remarkable, the change that we've seen in the last 5 years. You would have never expected, they had it was last summer, late last year, they had an electronic music festival out in the desert where sort of a bunch of Saudis went out and were dancing to DJ, this was completely unthinkable, not very long ago. And so in certain ways, it's happened very quickly. At the same time, as I said before, there's levels of Saudi society that we just don't know very much about, and kind of what's happening there.
And lastly, Alan asks, there's been discussion about MBS being named king. Some say that King Salman will step down soon, perhaps. Any comments on that? And then maybe lastly, kind of, where do you see MBS and Saudi Arabia in the next 3, 4, 5 years?
Oh, 2 questions about the future. I mean, the reports about King Salman abdicating and naming MBS king have become somewhat perennial. They tend to come up every 6 to 9 months, and then everybody sort of gossips about them, and do you think it's true and whatever. So far, it hasn't been true. It's certainly possible. It would be quite a remarkable event. The only previous king who's abdicated was basically forced out by other members of the family, because he was not deemed to be a good king. That's not going to happen with Salman. But it is possible, I guess, that Salman could decide to abdicate. I certainly can't predict whether that's going to happen or when. What to expect in the next few years? I mean, Saudi Arabia has a lot of pressures on it that we're building, and then certainly coronavirus is going to accentuate things. And so, really, I think the challenge for them is, they had already, Mohammed bin Salman had already laid out an incredibly ambitious, and I think many people would say, unrealistic reform program in terms of what he was going to do with the economy, how many jobs he was going to create. We're going to create an entire tourism sector, an entertainment sector. We're going to start making our own movies. We're going to, start open a new mining industry, all these various things. And so these things would have been difficult enough to do if, we had been where we were last year. They're going to be even more difficult to do now, just for financial reasons. The fact that the coronavirus has locked down Saudi Arabia, the way that it's locked down the United States, it's going to be, there's going to be a financial blow there. Oil prices being low obviously give them less money in the budget to work with. And then they're effectively canceling the Hajj. I mean, they didn't say so, but they had 2.5 million people come for the pilgrimage last year. This year, it's at most going to be a few thousand people. many, many billions of dollars that would have come into the Saudi economy that are just not going to be there this year. So, that's the challenge that they have to figure out is, how do they still continue on the path of these incredibly ambitious reforms with much, much less capital to work with?
Well, again, I want to thank you all for joining us today, and hope to see you again on July 15th when we host Richard Haas, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. And I highly recommend Ben's excellent book, MBS. If you're curious at all about not just MBS, but kind of the modern realities of Saudi Arabia, it's an excellent, fascinating book, and it puts together so many facets. There's a great and complete picture, not just of him, but everything that's happening in the country and the region really in the last few years. I would definitely recommend it. And Ben, I want to thank you so much for joining us, and we'd love to have you again at some point. And take care, and all the best in Beirut. Thank you.
Someday maybe I'll make it to Houston.
That'd be great. We'd love to have you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. Thanks a lot. Yeah. Bye-bye.